and
Now we're
welcome
ready.
to those who shaped and formed us. Last week, as you remember, Rob shared two of his favorite poets, and so I thought, well, why not? I'll share two of my favorite poets. But they are from a completely his were more traditional, I think. Certainly more, maybe more well known. But the two poets that I'm going to talk about today that have shaped and formed me, the first is Mary Oliver, whose anniversary of her death is tomorrow.
Recording in progress.
She will have been dead 5 years tomorrow. 5 years tomorrow. And the second one is Rumi, who is a Persian poet from way long ago, the 14th century. So I'm going to ask that unless you're going to have something to say, or which I hope you do, that you'll mute yourself because I'm getting a lot of feedback from maybe you all are in the same house. Ginger, is Pat with you? Is that what's happening?
Yes, Pat is with me at my house.
Right. Well,
Good.
So you want us just to have one machine?
Well, just one. You need to turn off the. You need to mute one of them.
Okay, I'll mute mine.
Okay, let's see if that. I'm not getting the feedback now, so I think that's fine. That's great. Well, ladies, well, we'll be talking about a lady, so that's good. I chose Mary Oliver because
Oh gosh,
why did I choose Mary Oliver? I chose Mary Oliver because I've been reading her poetry since I was in high school.
I was hoping you
And
just
we share a common state of birth and a common kind of geographic beginnings, the same roots, if you will. Like she was born in Maple Heights, Ohio, and one of her first published books of poetry was called River Styx, Ohio, and Other Poems. And River Styx, which you know is a mythical place, actually is also a real place. Why anyone would want to name their town River Styx, I don't know. Since if you remember your Greek and Roman mythology, it was the road. It was the river to hell, right? It was the crossover space between this land, living, and the afterlife. So, but in any case, there's a park there, and it is a crossroads. They closed their post office in the 80s, but I did go to the park as a child and as a young adult, and it is a lovely place in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, and I think maybe where Mary learned to love nature the way she did. She's mostly known for her nature poems, but they are not just descriptive of nature. I think that's the thing. They always point toward something else. And what they point toward is while she never identified herself as an Episcopalian, she certainly wrote poetry like one. And the connection between our lives, this life, the natural world, and God come through again and again. And they informed me because they were honest, I think. They pointed toward a certain vulnerability. She also wrote a lot of poetry about loss and about continuing on through loss, which is the human experience, isn't it?
If you want to push that up the middle here, we could just.
We all experience loss. Getting some crossover, y'all, from some conversations you might be having offline. So,
what about everybody mute? Just mute.
Thank you, Anne. I'm only the priest. I don't know. I can't make people do anything. So I'd like to start with this first poem. I'm going to pull it up on my screen. Do you all have the materials in front of you? I can share my screen with you. She said optimistically. Okay. So the first poem I'd like to read is called Breakage. I go down to the edge of the sea. How everything shines in the morning light. The cusp of the whelk, the broken cupboard of the clam, the opened blue mussels, moon snails, pale pink and barnacle scarred, and nothing at all whole or shut, but tattered, split, dropped by the gulls unto the gray rocks and all the moisture gone. It's like a schoolhouse of little words, thousands of words. First you figure out what each one means. The jingle, the periwinkle, the scallop, full of moonlight. Then you begin, slowly, to read the whole story. I don't know if it's the way she puts together the words, or there's a scarcity to them that points to something larger, right? It's a few words that say a great deal. It's interesting to me is that I have always been drawn to the broken shells on the seashore. Yes, isn't it grand when you can find a whole sand dollar? Yes, of course. But I love it when I find the bits and pieces and imagine how they came to be there. And I think that's partly what she's saying there always. And I wrote this little part. It's not that straightforward, the poem itself. And the flurry of images introduces something far more complex and interesting than just an idyllic day at the beach. Look at the words and think about what's being suggested. Cusp, whelk, broken, clam, opened, blue, pale, scarred, tattered, split, and dropped. Oliver lingers lovingly over each image as if she's picking each object up and turning it over in her fingers, inspecting, observing, and inviting us to do the same. She's not feeling despair or bitterness. This isn't a poem about how everything is broken and nothing is whole and the world is awful. No, she's fascinated and she wants to know more. Her honesty in these things compels me toward vulnerability and honesty. And so that maybe says a lot about how I see the world as well. That poem is from Why I Wake Early, her new poem collection. One of the things about moving is that I actually don't have any of her books of poetry here. They're all in a box marked poetry, which I have no idea which storage unit it's in or if it's on a truck now, where it is. So a lot of this I'm having to do with the help of Google and memory. Do any of you, so can I go on and read the next poem? Are we okay with that? This one's called Don't Hesitate. Sorry I know sometimes the flippy screen makes me feel like I'm having a seizure.
You look okay to me.
Good, I'm good, all right. Don't Hesitate, this poem is called. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. And I couldn't help thinking of you, Ginger, when we were talking the other day about joy and how we find it and how we think about it, how we pray about it. And the last line, joy is not made to be a crumb. It's the whole loaf, isn't it? It's the whole thing. And There's so
Yes, the
much
whole
in,
book.
yes, there's so much in in these few words about the both end of our lives, about the things that are sorrowful and painful, and about the possibility that when we pay attention, which is another poem I'm going to read in a minute, how we might begin to see the bits of joy that really do make up the world. But how often is it that we can be overwhelmed by the things that aren't pretty or nice or fun or that are sad, right? She doesn't ignore the sadness of our lives at all. And I grew up in a family that never talked about their sadness, because we're not supposed to talk about that. We're only supposed to talk about good things, and we're supposed to smash away the rest, I guess. So when I read her poetry, I knew that I wasn't. I think we've all had that feeling that there wasn't something wrong with me because I was sad about something, right? That sadness is on the wheel of feelings, as I learned later in therapy, that it's on that wheel and as important as any of the other feelings that we have, and to not take them together, to recognize their weight. But man, it's like losing a body part, right? It's not the fullness of who God created us to be. And the fullness is what some of her poetry allowed me to see and believe that that is the way God created us, to have that full range of emotion and sight and experience. So I wrote here that her poetry can be read like prayers, at least that's how I've read them, full of humility, yearning, and awe. And as I said earlier, her faith doesn't fit into one or any organized religion. She still considered herself a deeply spiritual person. She embraced the idea of God in many of her prayers while being comfortable about not having all the answers. Again, something that wasn't really encouraged. Maybe generationally, it could just be my family, but generationally, we were supposed to be raised to know the answers, to solve problems, to appear to all those watching that we had it all together. Her openness toward seeing the divine in nature's wild beauty is often reflected in her poems, and in the past, Oliver called herself a praise poet. What a lovely phrase. So while not an Episcopalian, she was connected to the universe in ways that inspired me. She spent time considering the birds of the air, right? That's Jesus's admonishment to us in Matthew 6. And she explored places of doubt and recovery, of loss and love. And again, what I experience and admire and have been most encouraged by in her poetry is her honesty. This poem is read frequently, and you may all have heard it. It's called The Journey. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, through the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible, it was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voice behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company. As you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. There is that moment in our life, and it usually happens, I would say, well, for me, it happened in my late 40s. And some people have it earlier and some people have it later. I get that. There's not a prescribed time for it. But when we do begin to take seriously kind of probably what has been who we are since our birth, we begin to uncover it, to recover it, to it's like a new learning, isn't it? It's just like a new way of being shaped. Now, mine led this, the only life that I could save led to me going to seminary. That sort of unveiling of layers of what I thought I should do, what I thought other people wanted me to do, what I'd been taught to do, just, layer upon layer of that. And then this poem helped me hear there was an opportunity to do something differently. There were other things that happened. There were other things, and you'll hear more about those in the weeks to come, about the other things that have shaped and formed me. But this poem, I mean, I could just feel it, the things tugging at my ankles, the weight of things, the sense that it might be too hard for me to overcome it. Thinking that I had other things I had to do, that list of life. Well, when I get through this, then I'll do that. When this happens, I'll be able to do this. And finally, I realized that I had to listen with God's help for me. That was what it required for me, to what God was calling me toward, what God had been calling me toward, and yes, all the things that had formed and shaped me before that time, or before as a child, and all of that had been important, is important. But once I realized that the only life that I could save was my own life, it also released all those who knew and loved me, my children and my husband, released them to have their own lives as well, instead of thinking I had to control all of that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So
This is a great poem.
There was some. Yeah, it is a great poem. There was some. There's some expansiveness that happens, as you let things go, and then there's the sort of fear that can come into that about what will happen. Maybe I really am all those things that everyone said I was, or whatever. It's just that balance between being vulnerable, accepting things about that, and then the certainty of what I thought I knew. Right? So which was, yes. Yeah. So here's another one from that same time period. It's called I Worried, and maybe you all can identify with this. I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? And if not, how shall I correct it? Was I right? Was I wrong? Will I be forgiven? Can I do better? Will I ever be able to sing? Even the sparrows can do it, and I am, hopeless. Is my eyesight fading, or am I just imagining it? Am I going to get rheumatism, lockjaw, dementia? Finally, I saw that worrying had come to nothing, and I gave it up and took my old body and went out into the morning and sang. Yes.
Amen.
Amen. See, it is like a poem, isn't it? I mean, it is like a prayer. Yes, it's just like a prayer. It probably does have to have an amen on it. Well, you'll have this in your paperwork. I'm not going to read the whole poem here, called Sometimes, which is just another one of those expressions of how we can get lost in our own head, in our own thinking. But anyway, it's what I love about this poem is her stanza number 4. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. Now those are, like, if I was going to get a tattoo, I think that would be my tattoo. I'm not ever going to get a tattoo. But if I would. I might get a t-shirt made with it. I like that part. So pay attention. This is hard for me because I can so be preoccupied with what I think, with what I want to know what you think about me. So I'm not really paying attention. And if I'm not paying attention, then there's no way I can ever be astonished. Which I think is being amazed, seeing the God in the world, seeing how God is active and alive. And then that courageous part, all of this requires courage, right? Tell about it. Tell about it. That means we have to own it, doesn't it? When we tell somebody something, we have to own it. So that's there in that. And then this is another terrific poem called Thirst, from her collection called Thirst. Another morning, and I wake with thirst for the goodness I do not have. I walk out to the pond, and all the way God has given us such beautiful lessons. Oh Lord, I was never a quick scholar, but sulked and hunched over my books past the hour and the bell. Grant me in your mercy a little more time. Love for the earth and love for you are having such a long conversation in my heart. Who knows what will finally happen or where I will be sent? Yet already I have given a great many things away, expecting to be told to pack nothing except the prayers which, with this thirst, I am slowly learning. The echo there of Jesus's command to his disciples, right? Take nothing with you on that journey. That we have the knowledge, that I have the knowledge that, yes, some of it comes from books and study, and some of it comes from prayer. And some of it comes from experience and intuition and inner wisdom that has value. And this acknowledgement that we continue to learn, even if it's not on the pace of the world, that we learn at our pace, at the pace God has beautifully given us, this kind of unfolding. And so her poetry there, to me, it's the acknowledgement that there are other ways to learn, that there are other gifts we are given, that there are other opportunities to do that. So I think you're getting the gist of why I love her poetry and how it so resonated with me. This one you may have heard too, about praying. And because often we find it hard to pray. We wonder if we're doing it correctly, if we have the right words, if we're saying the right thing. And here's what she says about that. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot, or a few small stones. And here we are again with this phrase, just pay attention. Then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. So it can be about prayer for sure, but it is again about the willingness for us just to agree to participate. And this idea that it's a doorway. It's not the whole map. It's not the whole journey. It's not the whole of life. It's a doorway where God invites us into a different way of being. And this other voice that can speak to us. I'm pretty sure that all of you have had that experience of God's voice in something. Maybe it's a feeling. Maybe it's actual words. Maybe it's something you see or something you experience with another person. But us maybe taking away some of the expectations that we have for ourselves. I think this was my biggest hang up. What is it supposed to sound like? Who am I supposed to be? And then getting trapped in that kind of hamster wheel of achievement, doing it right, getting it right. And this is kind of a way to stop the hamster wheel. So the use of nature in her poetry is about what my therapist calls, and my spiritual director calls, soul work. Right? This is a work of cultivating, not in the same way we do with striving or perfection, but kind of an unfolding of what God has already done and is doing in our lives. And her poetry, I'm going to close with this poem. Her poetry, I think, all came out of some darkness in her early life. She suffered from nightmares for her whole life related to whatever that trauma was in her early childhood. She's never been, I don't know exactly what that was, but her recovery into life and the acceptance of all of our lives is what inspired and healed me, right? She didn't shut that away. She didn't deny it so much as began to see it as pieces of the whole. And that's the journey I've been on for my entire life, is that I think later on I'm going to talk about Richard Rohr, who has been very instrumental to me. You know, he's a Franciscan priest in the Catholic Church and has the Center for Contemplation and Action. And he wrote a book some years ago called All That Belongs, or Everything Belongs, excuse me. And it gave me permission to sort of not just partition off the parts of my life that I thought were ugly or scary or sad, but knew that God was using all of that work in me, right? So I was able to embrace all of me instead of chopping off large sections of my life and acting as if they hadn't happened. I've slowly been, over the last 25, 30 years, reattaching them, in different places, putting myself back together like the scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz, restuffing my parts. So here's a poem that she wrote that I have found to be completely in its very few words. The Uses of Sorrow. In my sleep, I dreamed this poem. Someone I love once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift.
Mm.
And I remember the first time I read it, I cried. I was in a group with other women. Luckily I knew them quite well, so it wasn't embarrassing so much as I was overwhelmed by this sense that the things in my life that were dark, that had been painful, could also be a gift. It's not connected directly toward forgiveness or acceptance or redemption for any of the people who had given me the darkness, but it did allow me to see that I'm not a damaged person, right? I'm not a damaged person. So there was kind of a restoration to self in these few words. So I saved that one for last because it can be kind of it's a lot. So included in what you received in the materials is her, I think, pretty complete bibliography, which I included here because not only would you might like to see, and I've highlighted from where poems came from that I read, but it's also amazing just to look at that list. I mean, that is so prolific. That is incredible. Plus, she's been published in several other, like magazines, literary magazines, and so on and so forth. So, and she never graduated from college. So Jess would tell you that. She went to Ohio State, and I can't remember where else she went, but she never finished. Um, so that it leans back toward that thing where she was never that great of a scholar. But somewhere in her was this way to reflect. My lights are flashing here. I hope that's not a bad sign. I hope that doesn't mean we're going to lose power. Um, so hi, well, hi, Eleanor. When did you come on? You snuck
Um,
right in there.
I'll get the first half on YouTube.
Okay. Good to see you. Okay. What would you like to say about Mary Oliver? How many of you are familiar with her poetry? Well, wonderful. I'm glad I could introduce to everyone who doesn't know her work. I'm glad I
I
could
love
introduce.
her. She is good.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
read it very well.
Maybe
too.
someday we'll put maybe someday someone will make hymns of her poems. Wouldn't that be nice?
All right.
That
That'd
would
be
be
good.
lovely. Well, or if you are familiar with her work, do any of you have a favorite of her poems that you'd like to share? Not right off the bat? Okay. Well, the second poet, because it's already 10:30. So the second poet I wanted to talk about today that I feel like for many of the same reasons as Mary Oliver, but much more uh, uh, he uses much more God language than Mary does. But is Rumi. Now, how many of you are familiar with Rumi's work?
I am.
Good, wonderful. Well, not too long ago, we celebrated his 800th anniversary of his death, 850th or something. So he, on the other side, is ancient. He was a Persian poet, an Islamic scholar, a theologian, and a Sufi mystic. And he's from Iran, what is now called Iran. But Persia, was Iran, Iraq, a lot of that area, and was well known for their scholarship, both in the arts and in the sciences, many years ago. And Rumi continues to influence thought and literature in the Muslim world. Now, in the last 50, 60 years, when some of the Islamic world took a more fundamentalist interpretation, he's fallen out of favor with some of those sects, but not with all of them. And certainly his grave is one of the most visited. It's a pilgrimage spot still to this day. So you may have heard that term Sufi or Sufism, and it's connected with some other things you might know, like the whirling dervishes. You may have seen them. They wear a particular kind of dress that's all very symbolic, and that part of their, what is the word I want? Ecstatic expression of faith. Pretty much some ways, some of our Pentecostal brothers and sisters can get themselves worked up into this state of ecstasy, right, where they receive messages from God, able to speak in tongues, whatever those things are. It's just a different expression of faith than we Episcopalians are kind of used to in our worship. We're a much more subdued folk, aren't we? But so it's considered an inward dimension. Sufism is an inward dimension of Islam, sort of like contemplative prayer is an inward dimension, right? Centering prayer, any kind of contemplative practice where silence is the major component would be considered an inward dimension as opposed to an outward expression. But his poetry came first by this inward looking and inward practice, and then this outward thing that the Sufi mystics often participated in, which was the dancing. And so while he was dancing and singing, he would give his poems would come out, and someone would write them down. He would dictate the messages, the way what he was thinking, how he felt like God was speaking to him. So why would ancient Persian poet impact my formation? How would that be? Well, Again, these aren't my thoughts particularly, but I was glad to hear of them because it did help center my thinking about why I loved Rumi so much. Number one is he likes to directly address the readers in the second person, which is kind of unusual, this directness, because then I'm able to join with Rumi as the central character. I am the lover, the singer, the reed flute. And this kind of intimacy brought God nearer to me. I can hear the echoes in his poetry of the prophets, of the Psalms, of the Proverbs, of all the wisdom literature of our own tradition. And while I'm not a universalist, I was enlarged by his poetry and by his faith, the unrelenting, persistent desire of God for me and God for the world. And sometimes that's a message I need to hear a lot. That God is continually reaching out to me over and over and over again. That God is relentless in God's pursuit of me. And that no matter what. So this is a kind of a long poem, but I hope you'll enjoy it. It's called The Reed Flute. And I'm going to scroll up here. Listen to the story being told by the reed of being separated. Since I was cut from the reed bed, I have made this crying sound. Anyone apart from someone he loves understands what I say. Anyone pulled from a source longs to go back. At any gathering, I am there, mingling in the laughing and grieving, a friend to each, but few will hear the secrets hidden within the notes. No ears for that. Body flowing out of spirit, spirit up from body. No concealing that mixing. The reed flute is fire, not wind. Be that empty. Heart, the love fired, tangled in the reed knots as bewilderment melts into wine. The reed is a friend to all who want the fabric torn and drawn away. The reed is hurt and salve combining. Intimacy and longing for intimacy, one song. A disastrous surrender and a fine love together. The one who secretly hears this is senseless. A tongue has one customer, the ear. A sugarcane flute has such effect because it was able to make sugar in the reed bed. The sound it makes is for everyone. The days are full of wanting. My screen won't. Are full of wanting. Let them go by without worrying. Stay where you are, inside such a pure, hollow note. Every thirst gets satisfied except that of these fish, the mystics, who swim a vast ocean of grace, still somehow longing for it. No one lives in that without being nourished every day. But if someone doesn't want to hear the song of the reed flute, it's best to cut conversation short, say goodbye, and leave. So I'm thinking of the reed flute like as my connection to God, as someplace I've been, in some place where I was meant to be, and that when I'm separated from that, cut from that I'm not able to be all of whom God intended me to be. Such a beautiful, beautiful way of speaking about how God reaches out to us all the time. The second thing about Rumi's poetry is the urge to teach. You could hear that in that last poem. So as a frequent reader of inspirational literature, I'm drawn toward Rumi's poetry because of this union with God that he so well expresses. The gifts of the beloved. Where will you find one more liberal than God? He buys the worthless rubbish, which is your wealth. He pays you the light that illumines your heart. He accepts these frozen and lifeless bodies of yours and gives you a kingdom beyond what you dream of. He takes a few drops of your tears and gives you the divine font, sweeter than sugar. He takes your sighs fraught with grief and sadness, and for each sigh gives rank in heaven as interest. In return for the sigh wind that raised tear clouds, God gave Abraham the title of Father of the Faithful. And what do we remember about Abraham and his wanderings, his journeys, his doubts? Yes, his faithfulness, all in all, that God saw in Abraham a faithful person, as God sees in us also faithful people. And here's another one. There is a candle. There is a candle in the heart of man waiting to be kindled. In separation from the friend, there is a cut waiting to be stitched. Oh, you who are ignorant of endurance and the burning fire of love, love comes of its own free will. It can't be learned in any school. Again, going back to Mary Oliver, doesn't it, a bit? How what we observe in nature, or what we observe with the eye of our heart, can be as powerful or more powerful than any recorded knowledge in a textbook or place of learning. And for those of us who weren't great students, this is very heartful. This is very good news. And third, Rumi's use of everyday imagery. This is just a little poem called Eternal Life. Eternal life is gained by the utter abandonment of one's own life. When God appears to his ardent lover, the lover is absorbed in him, and not so much as the hair of the lover remains. True lovers are as shadows, and when the sun shines in glory, the shadows vanish away. He is a true lover to God, to whom God says, I am thine, and thou art mine. He who believes in me believes also in he that sent me, right? There's an echo there of that communicative property of love that we know so well from the Gospel of John, that we hear over and over again. Here is Rumi's take on that love, of the foreverness of it and the ways that it cannot be broken. Here's a little prayer this is a little poem called A Prayer. Pray in this wise and allay your difficulties. Give us good in the house of our present world. Give us good in the house of our next world. Make our path pleasant as a garden, and be thou, O Holy One, our goal. A mantra that we might want to add to our daily prayers. Give us good in the house of our present world, and give us good in the house of our next world. Indeed, give us good. So to me, sometimes remembering that there is good even in amongst things that seem not so good. And the fourth thing about Rumi's poetry is his optimism of the attainment of union, right? This possibility that many current contemplative folks write about, whether that's Thomas Merton or Richard Rohr or Thomas Keating or Basil Pennington, some people we think of as modern contemplatives, right? This is that idea of union as being the goal of this relationship. Our contemplation leads us to a place of union. And this has helped combat my feelings of worthlessness, my feelings of having to prove myself. All these things have been important to me in this. So he writes what are called ghazals, which I just love that word. They're love ghazals, they're romantic love poetry, the way he writes. The convention in that form is to stress its unattainability and the cruel rebuffs of the beloved. But see, this is different. So what I'm saying is, in a typical way that a ghazal is written, would begin to see like, sort of maybe like Keats wrote poetry, right? In the fact that there's a love that cannot be realized, right? That sort of way that we can hope for something, but it's usually unrequited. That is not what Rumi does. He does the opposite of that. He celebrates this union between God and God's people in this love relationship. So he turns that way before Keats and Yeats were, Keats was writing way before that, right? So he celebrates union. And with that, I think this is my last poem. Yeah. You also have to remember that all this poetry was translated, right? It was not written in English, right? It was written in Persian. And so for the past 100 years or so, people have been uh, rewriting his poetry, some with more license, some with less. Coleman Barks is a professor at Georgia, at the University of Georgia, who spent a lifetime working on the translations of Rumi. So when you go to buy Rumi, you might say it might be translated by, it might be paraphrases, it might be interpretations, right? So just it doesn't. I'm not sure. I'm not a perfectionist in this. I'm not. It's not one way that's better than another. Just sometimes it's good to know what you're getting. I think Coleman Barks did a great job in his translations. And there are other people who also did. Daniel Ladinsky is another guy that spent a lot of his life translating not only Rumi's poetry but Hafiz, who's also a Persian poet. So, however you want to look these up or find them or read about them, know that they were written in Persian. So there might be some, much as when we read scripture, we don't always get the true nuance all the time of maybe what the writer meant, because we don't know all. We know a lot. We know a lot now, but we don't always know about the punctuation, or we don't always know about the translation of a particular word or sentiment. So we always take that into mind. But this is one of Rumi's probably most famous poems, called The Guest House. This human being is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. And I hope you can see that as I chose to end each of my reflections on those who formed and shaped me, there's a similarity to what's been important to me, right? This poem as well. Also, if any of you have ever heard of welcoming prayer, this idea that we welcome so I can tell you this about me. So my biggest vice is envy and jealousy. So learning how to invite those in, not just block everything out like I could do that, because I don't, but recognize where I'm envious and where I'm jealous and say, hello, old friend, good to see you again. Because what's going to be the thing, and it has helped me better understand those emotions and where they come from, and what is the gift that they bring. What do I learn about myself when I recognize my envy and my jealousy? And here is this thought, this whole line: even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Wow, what great imagery. But this last lines: be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So if there's something about me being formed and shaped, I guess it's that I'm learning to accept all that is, because somehow, somewhere, some way, God is in that and with that and for that. Hopefully forming and shaping me and continuing to do that without shame, without guilt, and without remorse. So I thank these two poets, and I thank you all for taking the time to be with me this morning as we engage this together. I hope you find these bits of poetry, maybe they'll find some place to land in your heart and soul as you do your own soul work. And I look forward to a time, maybe in person, where we can all discuss this in another way. So thank you all. Next week, Rob will be back. I don't know yet who he's chosen, but in 2 weeks, I'm not sure that everybody's going to find this as interesting as I do, but I'm going to be talking about my grandparents. So, because they played a major part in my life then and now. So, anything else for the good today?